Good evening, everyone. My name is Rabbi Julia Andelman. I'm the Director of Community Engagement here at JTS, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this wonderful program tonight. In addition to welcoming all of those of you here in person with us, I'm very pleased to welcome all of those joining us via live stream tonight, many individuals around North America, and also give a shout out to the members of B'nai Torah congregation in Boca Raton and any other congregational groups that are participating in the program tonight. We'll begin the program in just a moment, and I wanted to make two brief announcements before that because this is a conversation about Israel, two Israel-related announcements. One is that, as many of you may know, the elections for the World Zionist Congress are currently underway. The World Zionist Congress will convene later this year in Jerusalem and will directly influence the allocation of hundreds of millions of dollars for initiatives that will have an impact on the nature of Israel and its ties with world Jewry for years to come. The Merkaz slate number 2, is the voice of conservative Masorti Jews around the world in the World Zionist Congress, and its goal is to build the Jewish state as an exemplary, pluralistic, and democratic society that every Jew can proudly call home. It works with the WZO and lobbies within the Knesset for primarily, most notably, the equality of all streams of Judaism in Israel, and for a society committed to peace with its neighbors, social justice, gender equality, respect for minorities, environmental sustainability, and the security of the state of Israel and Jews everywhere. So if you are inclined to vote tonight in the WZO elections, and for Merkaz in particular, we're making that opportunity available to you. You can always do it on your smartphone, but we also have computers up in the lobby on your way out. The website is votemerkaz.org. And any Jew who will be 18 years old or older by June 30th is eligible to vote. The elections close on April 30th, and there is a $10 registration fee to vote. So that's that announcement, votemerkaz.org. And the second announcement is that this evening ushers in Yom HaZikaron, the Memorial Day for Israel's fallen soldiers and victims of terror. So at the close of the program tonight, we'll be having a brief ceremony to mark that occasion. So I just wanted to alert you to that in advance. On that note, I'd like to welcome Chancellor Arnold Eisen to begin the program.
Thanks, Julia. I also want to welcome everyone to JTS, welcome those who are watching us in the live stream, and for those of you who are here for the first time, don't make it your last. There are numerous public events at JTS, and you are sitting immediately below the greatest Jewish library in the Western Hemisphere, the second greatest Jewish library in the world, second only to the National Library of Israel, and the treasures of that library are available for you. Tours can be arranged. Our librarian, David Kramer, is here with us this evening. JTS in general is available to you, and I urge you to take advantage of what we have to offer. This is the moment for me to ritually remind you to please silence all cell phones. This is the Gerson Cohen Memorial Lecture, established by the late Judge Harold Holtzman, who passed away last year, in tribute to Gerson Cohen, who was the Chancellor of JTS from 1972 to 1986, was one of the greatest historians of Judaism and Jewry of his generation, and was a man who was passionately concerned about the relationship between American Jews and Israel, and passionately worried that that relationship was fraying and that American Jews and Israeli Jews were moving further and further apart. This has, of course, only been exacerbated with each passing year since Gerson Cohen's death. In a minute, I'll be introducing the speakers of tonight's program, but first let me say a word about this conversation and urge you to join us on Twitter. The hashtag is JTSIsrael. I hope you will join this conversation because if I can editorialize for just a moment, I believe this conversation about conversation is urgent and is essential to American Jewish life right now. Here we have one of the major issues on the Jewish agenda, one of the great ethical issues of our time. Israel stands at the center of all sorts of worldwide debates, and in many quarters of American Jewry, Israel is a non-subject. It is a non-subject partly because of indifference. If you ask American Jews, how much do you care about Israel? The percent that says they care a lot is consistently only about 30%. The percent that says they don't care at all is also about 30%. Not only that, we have a suspicion, a worry, that speaking about Israel in any way, shape, or form that is remotely critical is going to give aid and comfort to Israel's enemies. And there are those who seek to shut down debate about Israel for that reason, and in many quarters they have. I dare say that there are synagogues in the United States, and I know them, where you cannot say a good word about Bibi or about settlers. There are synagogues in the United States where you dare not say a good word about the peace process or about Obama. There are quarters in this country where Jews feel excluded, either because they have a certain line on Israeli government policy or because they favor open debate when others believe that open debate should not be permitted. So what we're here to do tonight is figure out how we can talk to each other honestly, lovingly, soberly, thoughtfully, judiciously, responsibly about Israel, and see if we can establish some parameters for that conversation, and see if we can find ways to talk about Israel which don't further divide an American Jewish community which is already terribly fractured. In a minute, we're going to hear from three panelists, and when they conclude, Rabbi Julia Andelman will come up to the podium again and moderate a conversation among them, and then we'll throw the floor open to your questions and comments. So it's now my pleasure to introduce this evening's panelists. J.J. Goldberg is editor-at-large of the Jewish Daily Forward, was its editor-in-chief from 2000 to 2007. He has served as U.S. Bureau Chief of the Jerusalem Report and managing editor of the New York Jewish Week. His books include Jewish Power, Inside the American Jewish Establishment, and his writing has appeared in the New York Times, the Daily Beast, and Haaretz. Jonathan S. Tobin is senior online editor and chief political blogger at Commentary Magazine. He covers the U.S.-Israel relationship, Middle East diplomacy, the Jewish world, and the American political scene. He writes regularly for the Weekly Standard and the American Spectator, and appears often on CNN, Fox News, and NPR. And finally, Rabbi Melissa Weintraub, who was ordained at JTS in 2006, trains leaders at the intersections of Israel, Jewish thought, and conflict resolution. She is co-founder and co-director of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs, Resetting the Table, Open Conversations on Israel. She was also the founding director of Encounter, which strengthens the capacity of the Jewish people to be change agents in transforming the Israel-Palestinian conflict. It's now my pleasure to invite the panelists to come to the stage.
Good evening. I'm delighted to be here. How many of you would say that Israel is a source of tension in the Jewish communities or institutions of which you're a part? Raise your hand. How many of you would say that disagreements on Israel are avoided in the Jewish communities or institutions of which you're a part? How many of you often avoid conversations with people with whom you disagree? How many of you have ever experienced a damaged relationship over Israel? Wow. I don't know if you were all looking around. I have the bird's eye view. Israel has become the most volatile wedge issue in the American Jewish community, and just about any Jewish audience that I could ask those questions to would have pervasive hand-raising. This is a time of immense disagreement and anxiety among American Jews about Israel. Some are worried sick about what they see as the perils of a misguided, if not disastrous, deal with Iran, the emboldening of terror networks, and instability throughout the Middle East. Some about what they see as a frightening erosion of Israel's democratic status and regression, if not and stalemate, if not outright regression in Israel's relationship with Palestinians. Whether one sees the threats to Israel as primarily internal or external or both, American Jewry is arguably facing unprecedented conflict over these questions, a level of combative debate that hasn't been seen since the founding of the Jewish state. The most extreme versions of this intra-Jewish conflict include smear campaigns, character assassinations against some of the most prominent members of the New York Jewish community. Where I live in the Bay Area, people actually spitting at each other and at barricades. But there are far more subtle forms of adversarialism and escalation as well. Caricatures and distortions of each other's positions in print or in interpersonal exchange to make each other sound ridiculous, listening in order to find flaws, speaking in order to score points, arguing against straw men rather than on the merits. In the face of these tensions, it is entirely understandable that so many communities are saying Daikvar, enough already. Enough conflict and controversy. This has simply gotten too ugly. A Jewish Council for Public Affairs study found that more than a third of US rabbis now fear touching Israel from the pulpit. My friend Rabbi Scott Perlow calls this the death by Israel sermon. Most Jewish social justice organizations have overt policies not to touch Israel. We can't possibly, they say, build a coalition on any other issue and also touch that troublesome powder keg. Waves of people are disengaging, and even the people who do engage, for those who do engage, fatigue and burnout comes fast. Some communities say, let's do Israel programming, but keep it safe and uncontroversial by focusing on Israeli culture or achievements in tech. Others say, let's compartmentalize Israel engagement in advocacy and activism organizations rather than institutions like synagogues that are home to so many divergent views. But if we take the macro view, the effect of that fragmentation is to reinforce like-minded enclaves where we rally with those who are with us, take pride in the numbers of those who congregate and conference with us, while those who don't become increasingly unintelligible to us and seem ignorant, malicious, naive, even loony. We largely talk past one another, morally superior and self-certain, now and then colliding in frustration. Given this toxicity, the toxicity surrounding Israel in many corners of the American Jewish community, as I've said, these forms of avoidance certainly make sense. But we have reached a point as a community at which avoiding our disagreements is not just costly, it is downright calamitous to our communities, to our values, our people, and to Israel. And before I elaborate on why, I want to name one more form of skepticism or reluctance to engage. What a navel-gazing distraction. Lives are on the line. Israel's future is at stake. Talking with other American Jews on the Upper West Side or in Detroit or in Los Angeles feels to some like a big diversion from the real and urgent work that should be our focus of defending Israel's security and legitimacy on the one hand, and or seeking a just end to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So given the urgency, the stakes, the risks involved, why bother talking about Israel with people I may think just don't get it? Let me give you 4 reasons why. If we want to be politically effective wherever we stand, we are going to have to stop talking primarily to ourselves. Whether we're focused on building support and solidarity for Israel and or struggling to achieve justice, dignity, and human rights, we will not be able to advance those urgent agendas without better engaging those who are not our natural allies. Most Israel advocates are exasperated and at a loss by ineffectiveness at conveying messages to mainline Protestants, progressive Democrats, and alienated young Jews. Many progressives are lamenting ineffectiveness at being heard beyond their camp. It's not for nothing that Israeli journalists called this last election a dangerous game of bubbles. If it feels like wherever we stand, things are only getting worse, it's at least in part because we've retreated into those bubbles and lost both will and capability for effectively engaging across them. Reason number 2, why we should speak with people with whom we disagree. In a word, insight. If we're going to address the thorny impasse Israel faces, we're going to need a robust debate that hasn't happened in a century, since the decades in which Israel came to be. We will not learn enough from silence or echo chambers. Jewish tradition values argument, not just because we're a cantankerous people, but because we know it's the only method to good public decision-making, defining the liabilities of our own analysis and the best solutions to the problems we face. There is no other way to rise up to what this moment demands of us. We need unprecedented machloket l'shem shamayim, heavenly argument, for Israel to have a future. And we will certainly need heavenly argument for ourselves to remain a community as that future comes, whatever it brings. Israel cannot be sidestepped, and this is reason number 3. Israel cannot be sidestepped when it means so much to so many of us. There comes a time when avoidance is simply no longer viable. There is simply no way around this conversation but through it, in ways that strengthen community rather than derail it. I'm just coming from a 2-week stretch in which I've literally been sitting with people venturing into their disagreements on Israel courageously and respectfully almost every day, sometimes multiple times a day. And in the moment, I'm very in tune with a 4th reason, to dedicate ourselves to dialogue across disagreement. There may be no deeper spiritual work than finding God in the faces of those with whom we disagree without backing away from our honest disagreements. Extending the widest possible embrace of each other, even while taking in something objectionable or painfully hard to hear. Without getting wishy-washy, silenced, or compromised, finding a way for both ourselves and those with whom we disagree to come to voice. Communal leadership is now at a kind of tipping point in terms of recognition of the problem and the need for thoughtful, tough conversations on Israel, but most are at a loss for how to address the problem in practical terms. I want to briefly, before I close, share 3 strategies for building a healthier ecosystem around Israel that my partners and I at Resetting the Table have been developing over the last several years. And I'll save reasons why we think red lines on Israel are a bad idea in practical for the discussion that follows. I know that was one of the questions before us. So 3 strategies. First of all, we're building a bench and perhaps a whole new field of skilled practitioners with expertise to heal this conversation. There's a whole field out there of Jewish community organizing and social justice work. We're working on building the field that will bring conflict resolution expertise to the Israel conversation. Training, for example, facilitators to shepherd people through charged but meaningful conversation in a room. We have an 8-month-long training program in New York, and shorter programs like a 10-hour training program that we just ran for JTS rabbinical students that culminates tomorrow, actually, here at JTS. Number 2, we design forums and workshops to support people to have the conversations that matter most to them, but that they're intimidated or scared to have. Across their disagreements. Whether communities only have a few hours or they're able to invest in a long arc of programs. Picture APAC-affiliated groups, J Street U students, and other student organizations who are barely talking to each other, sitting down and poring over maps and histories and the things that they disagree about on more than a dozen campuses. Or on the more intensive side of things, designing an 18-month-long initiative at BJ, which we just launched this past weekend, geared toward disarming tensions and creating a vibrant, respectful public square where people want to come to synagogue to have this conversation that they've been avoiding. At the most systemic level, we work with national or local agencies, federations, JCRCs, rabbinical denominational bodies, to promote broader cultural shifts from norms of antagonism or avoidance to collaborative deliberation. And I'm happy to elaborate on all of these strategies in the Q&A and in our conversation. In this time of immense and genuine disagreement and grave concern over Israel, we can get consumed with frustration and alienation over the paths our fellow Jews are taking or the paths they are neglecting. Believing we're endangered by too much or too little defense of Israel, too much or too little critique. But we believe we weaken rather than serve the Jewish people, Israel, our most sacred principles, and even our political efficacy when we attack, dismiss, shut down, or avoid those with whom we disagree. And I hope you will join us in bringing Machloket L'Shem Shamayim, heavenly disagreement, to some of the weightiest, most fraught, most important dilemmas our people has ever faced for our communal bonds, our values, the Jewish people, and for Israel. Thank you.
Good evening. In case, since we didn't introduce who exactly we are, I'm Jonathan Tobin, from Commentary Magazine. It's my friend JJ from the forward there. So, arguing for the sake of heaven is something some of us do for a living. We debate, we probe for ideas, we talk about Israel, we talk about the Jewish community. And these are values that those of us, whether we're on the right, the left, somewhere in the center, should respect and value. And we should, and speaking as someone who has spent much of his career in Jewish journalism, running community newspapers, I can tell you the thing that I am most allergic to is the thing that somehow is the thing that most American Jews love to tell each other to do, which is to shut up. We're very big on telling each other to shut up. And in reaction to that, I think many of us, certainly in the professional sphere, tend to value what we sometimes used to call the cult of consensus within the Jewish community, bringing everybody together, and we value inclusiveness as well as civility. But we also have to sometimes consider that inclusiveness is not the only virtue. It is not the only value we can be defending. Because while I am someone who has debated on stages with J Street, with people who I disagree with about Israel, the thing that I believe, and that I hope those of us within the community, within the pro-Israel community, within the Jewish community, the value that we would respect is that our community must stand with Israel. Now, when I say with Israel, that doesn't mean a certain group of politicians. It doesn't mean the government of this day or the government of another day. Israel is, after all, run by politicians just like our own country is run by politicians. And we should be skeptical about them, skeptical about the generals, whether you agree with them or disagree with them. But in the end, we also have to ask ourselves, as a community, are we agnostic about Israel? Are we now so inclusive? Are we so dedicated to the idea of dialogue for its own sake that we're willing to say, come on in. Come in and join our community and help change our community, even if you wish to destroy Israel, even if you do not believe in any kind of Israel, not a left-wing Israel, not a right-wing Israel, no Israel. And that is where talk of red lines is not inappropriate. Because a community that stands for nothing, not a left-wing agenda, not a right-wing agenda within a Zionist perspective, but which no longer is willing to say, as long as you're for Israel, its right to exist, its right to self-defense, we can disagree about the borders, we can disagree about settlements. Those are all fair arguments. Those are arguments for the sake of heaven. But I would assert that an argument about whether there should be an Israel is not the argument that we within our community should be sponsoring, nor is it an argument that we should be facilitating. We see on campuses around the country the idea that Jewish groups would host BDS advocates of the economic war on the state of Israel. And when they are told by national groups like Hillel that that isn't appropriate, they're told that they're repressing free speech. This isn't a free speech issue. This is an issue about what we stand for as a community in the broadest possible sense. Because if we can't stand for an Israel of any kind, if we can't say to the advocates of BDS, sure, you have a right to advocate, this is a free country, but not on my dime, not within my synagogue, not within my Jewish institution, Because if our Jewish institutions, wherever they stand on the religious or political spectrum, if they become neutral about Israel, if they become facilitators of dialogue about Israel, that is not about within a Zionist context, that is not about whether we should have an Israel at all, but it is about questioning the value of it at all, then where are we and what are we? What kind of a Jewish community do we become when we become neutral about Israel in its broadest possible sense? That, to me, is not advocacy for dialogue. That's advocacy for suicide as an effective community, as a Jewish community. Because if we value those things, what are we doing then? What people who want into the community would say, either include me, even if I'm a BDS advocate, show me respect, don't repress me. They're not asking for inclusiveness. They're asking for the right to undermine the ability of our community to support Israel to any extent. That is a colossal mistake in my mind. And it's happening at a time, we're not operating in a vacuum here. Let's understand something. We're meeting here tonight at a time when there is a rising tide of global anti-Semitism. We know it, we see it on the streets, we know about it in France, we know about it in Sweden, and we cluck our tongues and we say, isn't that terrible? And we say, not here in America. And for the most part, we're right. I believe in American exceptionalism. But the exception to American exceptionalism is becoming our college campuses, where anti-Semitism is getting a foothold. And let me make a very strong point here, which perhaps is not shared by everybody within the community. When we speak of BDS, which is, I believe, the fundamental threat, the real, we have to keep our eye on the ball. Because, people like JJ and myself, we've spent our careers in the left-right debate, the old, let's argue about settlements, let's argue about borders, who's right, who's wrong in Israel. And, it's been very entertaining, and it's shed some light, some heat. But I believe to a certain extent that argument is obsolete. We can go on, and we should go on, disagreeing about what Israel should be, our vision of its society. We can disagree about the borders and the settlements. But unfortunately, if that is the focus of our Israel advocacy, if that is the focus of our interest in Israel, we're missing the point, because I believe this is a moot argument. And that's why sort of the understanding of the election returns in Israel. Because right now, peace with the Palestinians is something that most people in Israel don't see as something that can happen in the foreseeable future, even if most of them would like to see it happen. A lot of people in this country haven't gotten that message. That's okay. But if we are going to focus our efforts on refighting these battles, do you like Bibi? Do you not like Bibi? You Labor, Likud, American Jews are like baseball fans. We root for our teams, and sometimes we even go visit them at the ballpark in Israel, but for the most part we watch them on TV. But these are empty arguments. Because the real argument about Israel now is not about the settlements, it's not where the border should be, it's whether there should be an Israel. That's where the focus of the BDS argument is. That's what we're seeing in Europe, and the thin edge of the wedge on American campuses here is on that. And we've had a couple of very interesting incidents in recent months, where we've had outbreaks, where we've had incidents where it's clearly BDS has crossed the line, is seen as crossing the line into anti-Semitism, where Jewish students are being quizzed on their identity and their faith, being singled out because they're Jewish. And I believe this is not an accident, because when you single out a single country, a single people, and deny to them that which you would not deny to anyone else, that's an act of bias. The term of art for acts of bias against Jews is anti-Semitism, and that's where I see this war against Israel being carried out on our campuses. And against that, yes, as much as Jewish unity is an illusory objective, we have to try to be unified on that. As much as we disagree, from the forward to commentary and everything in between and everything on the outside of it, If we can't agree on that, then we're not standing up. We're standing for nothing. And that has to be our objective. That has to be where our focus is. Because if we don't, we're truly failing. You know, the argument now is, as much as I know we're focused on people feeling that they're being silenced, I can tell you as a Jewish journalist, I don't hear a lot of silence in the Jewish community. I hear a lot of argument. And a lot of it's healthy, some of it not so healthy. I deplore, as I think everybody in this panel does, acts of disrespect or delegitimization against people in the community, whether it comes from the left or the right. But if we cannot stand up, if we can't draw a bright line between those who wish to destroy Israel and those who just have different visions of it, then we don't understand anything about what it means to be a Jewish community. And that is where our focus must be. And if we don't do that, then we're truly failing. Thank you, and I'll look forward to more questions later.
Is there, by a show of hands, are there people here who are not familiar with the term BDS? Fair amount. The initials stand for Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions. It's a movement that was started by Palestinian activists. Originally, the granddaddy of the movement, Omar Barghouti, was actually a graduate student at Tel Aviv University, and wanted to encourage people around the world to boycott Israeli institutions, Israeli universities, including his own, Israeli trade unions, Israeli theater groups, freeze Israel out of, sort of like what was done to South Africa in the 80s. Israel passed a law in 2011, which was just upheld this week by the Israeli High Court of Justice, the Supreme Court. The law bans the advocacy in Israel of boycotting, divesting from, or sanctioning Israel. That is, an Israeli citizen may be sued for advocating the boycotting of an Israeli company or any company or institution in Israel or the territories under Israeli control. Which is interesting, first, because it acknowledges that the West Bank is not Israel. It's a territory under Israeli control. By saying you cannot boycott or advocate the boycott of institutions in Israel or territories under Israeli control, you're saying you may not advocate the boycotting of products made in settlements. In other words, you can think settlements are a bad idea for Israel's future if you believe that they make it harder for Israel to ever reach peace with its neighbors, but you can't do anything about it. You may not encourage people to show their disagreement with settlements by advocating shop. Now, ironically, one of the groups that's initiated all of these boycotts, it's called Im Tirtzu. It fancies itself a centrist Zionist organization. They campaigned against Ben Gurion University in the Negev, one of Israel's major universities. They wanted it to shut down its political science department because it employed professors who advocate boycotting Israel. Not the settlements, boycotting Israel. And because the university was protecting them on the grounds of academic freedom, Im Tirtzu was telling Ben Gurion University to shut down its political science department, and if they didn't, Im Tirtzu would tell donors to Ben Gurion University not to donate, to boycott Ben Gurion University. In other words, they were advocating a boycott of an Israeli institution for allowing its employees to advocate a boycott of Israeli institutions. The whole argument actually holds no water. Not too long ago, I was asked to join one of these dialogue groups to discuss how we achieve civility in the Jewish community. How to conduct civil discussions. Now, I usually don't join any group that I think I'm likely to want to report on, but the guy was very persuasive. We need your point of view and this and that. I said, okay, I'll go. I got the guidelines that we were going to be following, and it said, let's acknowledge that there is an angry debate within our community between those whose concern is Israeli security and those whose primary concern is Arab rights. And I thought to myself, all right, I'm not going to this thing. To tell me that it is clearly the right, which advocates Israeli security, and the left, which is mainly concerned with Arab rights, at the expense of Israeli security. Now, if you follow my writing, I very rarely talk about Arab rights. Mostly I talk about what's the best way of achieving Israeli security. So to say that the right's arguments are the arguments for Israeli security and the left's arguments are the arguments that aren't concerned with Israeli security is to start off the discussion by saying, let's have a fair and open discussion between those who care about Israel's survival and those who don't. I went to one session just because the guy said, try it, you can bring up your point of view. Bringing up my point of view was already losing, and I didn't go back. And I understand that those who are concerned with Israeli security and advocate or oppose the policies of the Israeli government, whether because they're mean to Arabs or because you believe they undermine Israeli security by making peace more difficult and encouraging war. If that's what you believe, if you believe that those arguments, the arguments advanced by J Street, for example, are a threat to Israel's survival, you're not going to be civil. Now, this isn't really a discussion about BDS. J Street doesn't advocate BDS. And the fight around the country is not about really advocates of BDS and whether they can come into the Jewish community. It's whether advocates of Israeli compromise, advocates, people who think the Israeli government's policies are mistaken in terms of what's best for Israel. That's the argument. Whether to keep them out. The fights on campuses are mostly about whether J Street can affiliate with Hillel, whether J Street can speak in a synagogue, not Jewish Voices for Peace, the groups that advocate boycotting Israel. And by the way, Jewish Voice for Peace advocates boycotting the settlements. They regard themselves as part of the larger BDS movement that advocates boycotting Israel, and much of which thinks Israel shouldn't exist. They identify with that movement, even though many of the people, it was founded by a Palestinian in Israel who thinks Israel should not be a Zionist Jewish state. Jewish Voice for Peace is in that hostile circle. But it doesn't advocate dissolving Israel or boycotting Israel. It hangs around with the wrong people. We want to keep them out. And I don't know if you've been following this thing. This same Im Tirtzu group that wanted to shut down the political science department at Ben Gurion, they've now gone on a rampage against the New Israel Fund, because the New Israel Fund funds some civil rights groups and Arab rights groups in Israel that, among other things, have members on their board who also advocate boycotting settlements, or in some cases, boycotting Israel, or who have participated, not as members of those organizations, but they are board members of those organizations. In other words, if you're somehow tied to boycotting Israel or something connected to Israel, and New Israel Fund supports your organization because it supports civil rights in Israel, New Israel Fund advocates BDS. The president of New York UJA Federation, a massive donor to Jewish causes, former president of the board of the Heschel School, is a donor to the New Israel Fund. There's a campaign against her, Elisa Doktorov, that the UJA should dump her as president. She has no right to be president of UJA because she's a donor to the New Israel Fund, which donates, which has members. There is no end to this thing. And the personal level of vitriol that's directed against her and other people like her is pretty extreme. They also want to prevent New Israel Fund from marching in the Israel Day Parade. They may not show their solidarity with Israel, according to this argument, because their solidarity with Israel is the wrong kind. They also want to bar Partners for Progressive Israel, which formerly was called American Friends of Meretz, or Meretz USA. It's an Israeli political party, a Zionist political party, which advocates boycotting settlement products. That's the parent organization, by the way, of Hashem Eretz Yair, one of the founders of Israel, among the leaders of the Palmach. They should be barred from the Salute to Israel parade because they're enemies of the... I mean, if you saw their latest press release, this group that wants to keep them out, it's... there's a temple in the Boston area that is having a session on Israeli peace movements or something like that, and the participants include Partners for Progressive Israel, J Street, and the New Israel Fund, and the headline of their press release is Temple Israel should uninvite extremist enemies of Israel. New Israel Fund, Partners for Progressive Israel, Hashem Eretz Yair, J Street. So, who should be invited in? Who should be part of our dialogue? Well, here's where it gets hinky. I actually got J Street mad at me a couple of years ago. I went to their first conference, wrote an article about it, and I said, if you want to be an advocate, they have two goals. One is to open up the discussion on Israel within the Jewish community, to have a platform where people can come with all kinds of views, critical views, diverse views, and feel comfortable. They want to be that kind of place. They also want to have an influence on American policy to push for Israeli concessions, liberal Israeli policies. And my position was you can't do both. They're both admirable. But if you're going to open up your discussion, I saw at their convention, they have people who favor boycotts. They have people who favor one state, who believe Israel should not be a Jewish state, that it should simply grant citizenship to the Arabs in the West Bank, end the Jewish state. They were very happy to be there. They were happy to be at a Jewish organization that lets them open their mouths and be part of the Jewish community. But they destroy J Street's legitimacy as participating in the Washington dialogue. If you want to be part of that dialogue, if you want to be an advocacy group, you have to have an identifiable position. So you can either be that open platform or that effective advocacy group. You can't be both. So what is the Jewish community? Well, the Jewish community is the community of Jews. That's what it is. We encourage people to care about Jews. We support organizations that lobby effectively on behalf of Israel. But not all of us agree with that. And the idea of excluding Jews because they have the wrong opinion about anything weakens us. When we show up on campus, when Hillel tells certain organizations like Jewish Voice for Peace or J Street, you cannot participate in Hillel because you don't support Israel the right way. Now, first of all, the Jewish Voice for Peace, they will tell you, most of them, they're engaged with Israel. They could just go out and get drunk and go to frat parties. But they're heavily involved with Israel. They care about Israel, not the way I like it. But that's their issue, Israel, what Israel should be doing. Why can't they show up at the Jewish community? Why can't Rav Shach, the Gadol Hador, he was the leader of ultra-Orthodox Judaism before he died in '88, I think it was. Somebody once asked him, an interviewer, what religion is closest to Judaism? He said, Chabad. You know, they believe their rabbi's the Messiah and that he's going to return, sort of like Christianity, but at least they still keep kosher. Rav Shach's Hasidim, or followers, would daven in a minyan with Chabad. They would not daven in a minyan with Reform Judaism. So there are many lines that divide us. To pick a line that's 100 years old, Zionism, and say that's the line that has to divide us and keep people out. More and more young people, you look at the surveys, young Jews are more liberal than their parents. When they see a community that tells them, Well, we can't let J Street into the building because Sheldon Adelson's against it. They see a community they don't want to be part of. So let me close with this. We have two great threats today in the world. One is the survival of Israel against its enemies or against various internal problems. I don't want to go into that. The other is the survival of the American Jewish community against the disappearance of its younger generations. Now, as most hardline Zionists will tell you, we can't tell Israel what to do. Israel can take care of itself. It's very good at it. It will take care of itself. And as the Prime Minister has said over and over again, if we need to, we will act on our own. Good, gesundheit. I will support most of what Israel does. I hope most of us in the room do. If you don't, I disagree with you. I'm happy you're here tonight. But nobody's going to save the American Jewish community but us. That's the one thing that we need to worry about. And if our worrying about Israel's survival and Israel's following the policies that we happen to like drives away our younger generation by telling them, you can't join, we're shooting ourselves, not in the foot, we're shooting ourselves in the head. Thank you.
I want to really thank all three of you for those very thought-provoking presentations. And I wanted to begin the kind of interactive portion of the program a little bit differently from how we normally do, in the spirit of really thinking about conversation and how we approach conversation. I hope that many of you received this little sheet on your way in, kind of inspiring you to think about how we have conversations. So what I want to invite you to do for about 2 minutes is turn to the person next to you, make a little ad hoc chavruta right now, and for 1 minute each, share something that's sticking with you from these presentations, a question that's really on your mind, or something bothering you, or really something, a genuine point of curiosity that you have for one of our speakers. We'll take 1 minute each to do that, and I'll invite you to go ahead and do that now.
They're all going to bathrooms.
Yeah, let's hope so.
Or checking out for the interesting part.
Yeah. Maybe there's food.
We were talking about viewers at home for this part.
About what?
People who are viewing it from their synagogues. That's why. Maybe they're turning to each other and talking to each other there in Boca Raton. Are these on?
Always consider that they're on.
I feel like we're going to get to another level tonight. Because I heard you in a different way.
I don't think I'm going to ask about what it is because I said so much so you can raise your. I'm going to give you each a minute to just kind of share your responses to each other. So maybe you guys
Okay. Like to give us a chance to respond to each other?
yeah.
Okay.
Lost you.
People are talking. They're talking. I think the talking period will be punctuated when JJ comes back.
I'll give you the 30-second warning now for this chavruta. Okay, so I'll ask you now to direct your attention back. To our speakers. And so the conversation now officially includes all of us, but we'll spend a few minutes giving the speakers a chance to respond to some of questions that I have and questions for each other, and then we'll open it up officially to the floor. So I actually wanted to give the three of you the chance to do what we just invited the audience to do, and take a moment to share with us and with each other. Is there something that you heard in one of your fellow panelists' remarks that's kind of really sitting with you, or that you really want to respond to, or some kind of reaction in this moment to something that you heard? Maybe I'll invite you to begin, Melissa.
Well, I'm thinking of something in particular that Jonathan was talking about. This is our third panel together. And I was just saying to him, I think we're really going to get somewhere this time. Because one of the things that I was thinking is that what I hear him saying, and you'll tell me if this is right, is I don't disagree with you, but I think inclusivity is a distraction, first of all, from the real enemies of the Jewish people, the real haters, the real delegitimizers, the real threats we're facing. And two, inclusivity is nice, it's good, but it has its limits. And we need to have bright lines. It's suicidal not to let those who hate us or seek to destroy us in. Is that right? Is that kind of capturing things that are important? Then I'll respond. That's not actually my response, but I want to make sure I understand you before I respond.
On one foot, I guess that would be.
On one foot. And that didn't feel caricaturing of your position. Did that feel like it gave it justice?
More or less. Well, I don't know if justice, but
okay.
You keep
no,
going.
I know. You're far more eloquent than I am, so I won't pretend that I could capture it all. So I think that maybe one of the things that I think of heavenly argument trying to do is actually clarify what is the crux of the disagreement, right? With real clarity. And I think that this may be where our disagreement lies, that I see limits and boundaries as actually counterproductive and destructive to support for Israel and to the very things that you talk about standing for. And there's many reasons why I think that's the case. I'll name just a few of them. One, that I think that they create an image of the Jewish people as very fearful, that is tremendously repellent to young people in particular, projects fear and weakness. And Daniel Hartman has been very articulate about this. It sort of sends a message that we can't defend Israel without censorship. We can't. We have to keep ideas outside on campuses that are an open marketplace of ideas, where people want to turn over every stone, even if they disagree with them. It is repellent, it's a turnoff. And number two, I think that the joke ends up being on us any way we try to substantively wall something out. I'll give you a couple of examples. Syed Kashua, who's a Palestinian Israeli, who's often hosted in mainstream Jewish institutions, because he boosts Israel's image as a tolerant, democracy-loving place. He published an article last year that was it was sort of the sophisticated, ironic, humorous article about why he supports boycotts and doesn't support boycotts. He said, I don't support boycotts because I know that it would mean boycotting myself, and I love Israel. And I support boycotts because because I love Israel, and explained why he thought that Israel needed pressure. And I literally had communal leaders talking to me about how they wanted to bring him because he was going to boost Israel's image, but they hoped no one was going to see this article because their guidelines didn't allow them to bring him. And there's so many other examples that I could trot out about the ways this is counterproductive. I'm going to give one more because I didn't address thread lines at all in my opening remarks. A couple of years ago, I was brought to St. Louis to speak alongside Anna Balzer, who's one of the spokespeople for the divestment movement. And I was brought by the Jewish community in St. Louis to convince a progressive Catholic audience that they should not support divestment. Now, they brought me to play that role. And what I did not do is hold a mirror up to this progressive Catholic audience that was largely in sympathy with Anna Balzer and say to them, you delegitimizing haters. Because that's not how they see themselves at all, and that would have completely alienated them. They see themselves as people who are pursuing justice and dignity and standing in solidarity with the oppressed. And so I said to them, instead, this is how your values can be expressed in a different way. Now, what that example illustrates is that I think it's actually quite dangerous to conflate a huge groups of people, and JJ really got at this a lot in what he was talking about, to conflate people who identify as Zionists but support selective or partial boycotts with people who perhaps support BDS for reasons of wanting to put on political pressure but still support Israel's right to exist. And to demonize sweepingly entire groups of people, I think that not making any of those distinctions actually is tremendously destructive, even suicidal, I would say, to our people. And I'm sure you disagree with much of what I said. I want to hear and hope that we're going to get to a point of clarifying exactly where the disagreements lie.
I think our disagreement, there are broad areas of agreement between all three of us on this panel, and we know each other. JJ and I know each other maybe a little better than you and I know each other, but of course there are broad areas of agreement, and as I said before, as someone whose job has been through much of my career the convener of the argument of trying to bring in diverse views, I'm sympathetic to the notion of trying to make our tent, our Jewish tent, our pro-Israel tent as big as it can be. Where I am in disagreement with the focus of your remarks, and indeed if this is to become the focus of the community, is that I see us sort of, you're pushing against something that I don't, you're sort of pushing against an empty, an open door. In that, I look on campuses, and I visit, I speak, I see, and I don't believe that the big problem there is that the pro-Zionist students are shutting up or quieting, the anti-Zionist students and faculty and the overall mise-en-scène at these universities. What I hear and what I see are pro-Israel students who are feeling increasingly marginalized, who are themselves delegitimized by the culture of the campus, which sees wrongly as being pro-Israel as being somehow offensive to contemporary liberalism. I'm not a liberal, but I don't think that's true. You can be a liberal, you can be a conservative, you can be a Republican, you can be a Democrat, you can be pro-Israel. But the problem I see on our campuses, the problem I see increasingly, is that it's that the pro-Israel students who are being shut up, or being intimidated, or being singled out, saying, "Are you Jewish?" Well, that means you're somehow tainted. That's our problem. I mean, here we are sitting on the Upper West Side here at JTS, and we're focusing a lot on the hurt feelings of some Jews who are being abused by some right-wingers. And when right-wingers, just as when left-wingers do it, there are left-wing Bolsheviks, there are right-wing Bolsheviks in our community and our society, and their impact is pretty lousy no matter where you go. But those right-wing Bolsheviks that we're focusing on here in this argument, you know what? They're the marginalized ones. They're not the ones who are calling the tune in Jewish communities. They're the ones railing at what they see as the Jewish establishment, which is hostile to their points of view. When I think of what should we be telling kids, what should we be telling students, what is the most important thing? And we talk about how are we defending Israel, and here we're talking about inclusion, and I think, and to a certain extent, fetishizing it, and dialogue. And then we're talking about we want to get them to Israel, we want to teach them the facts and all that, and that's very important. But the most important value right now for Jews out there who care about Israel is courage. It's the courage to stand up to professors who are basically adopting, left-wing professors who are dominant on campuses, who are delegitimizing Israel, to a campus culture which sees being pro-Israel as being somehow abhorrent. That, to me, is the real problem. That, to me, is the real issue. And it's connected not to our own angst about being told to being shut up by our fellow Jews, which we're all doing all the time. Trust me, You just look at my email every morning. I'm being told to shut up all the time. I'm sure JJ gets the same. If, you know, his
No, I
joke,
get different
his get different ones, or maybe we're telling it to each other, right? But, you know, but our problem is, can the Jews speak up at a time of rising anti-Semitism, at a time when delegitimization of Israel is on the march? It's now greater now after 20 years of peace processing than it was before. That's our problem. That's what I think we should be focusing more on. Being inclusive wherever possible within the community, within Jews who share, at least to some extent, our views that, you know, we're part of, we want in Israel. Argue about what kind of Israel it is, fine. But our problem is being able to stand up for it at all, and enabling and encouraging and giving voice to those willing to do so, not worrying so much about the hurt feelings of those who are trying to undermine that effort.
There was an exchange in Seinfeld once where George gets into an argument, I think, with Jerry, and he says, "No, I'm a much bigger idiot than you." And Jerry, no, I'm a bigger idiot than you. We Jews love to be victims. Actually, everybody loves to be victims. There's no the black community versus the Jewish community, Israel versus the Arabs. No, I'm the victim. No, I'm the victim. I'm the powerless, helpless one. After Abba Eban gave his famous Auschwitz Borders speech in the Security Council in '67, he was approached by an old friend of his from the British Labour Party, Richard Crossman, Jewish guy, prominent in the Labour Party. He said, you know, Aubrey, you're exaggerating a little bit. I mean, you survived for 19 years so far with those borders. And Eban said, you need to understand, Richard, we are a wounded people. And Crossman replied, yes, but you're a wounded people with an atom bomb. We're not that helpless. Now I'm going to say something that most of you are going to hate, but I'm going to say it anyway. Many people on campus, many liberal politicians, many professors, many activists, read the newspapers and they see a Jewish community that is in the business of trying to keep Israel in the territories and silence any opposition. There's a myth that's been created partly because of the activity of people like Paul Wolfowitz. I mean, their names end in "its," and ski, and so it looks like Jews advocated the Iraq war in order to protect Israel, when in fact Israel was against it. When we become a movement rather than a community of people who share a similar background, share a common religion, or divided by their common religion, when we say we stand for this, then if you don't agree, you're against us. Here's where we stand. We will fight anybody who disagrees with us as a group. Anybody who's with us is with us. Anybody who's not with us is outside of our group. Somebody then shows up at a UCLA student thing and says, yeah, I'm active in the Jewish thing. And they want to go, well, what does that mean? If you're active in the Jewish community, are you with all of this stuff we've been reading about? She's on trial. One more thought. I just heard a lecture yesterday. Stephen M. Cohen, the sociologist, he categorizes the difference between left and right in the Jewish community as essentially over this one issue. Do you feel that peace is possible or not? The right tends to believe peace is not possible, and that the Israeli government has done what it can, but there's nothing to be done. The left tends to believe that peace is in fact possible, and that the Israeli government could do more. Now, it has been 20 years. The number of settlers has tripled in those 20 years. Hostility toward Israel and the Jewish community has grown in the 20 years since the Arab world and the Palestinians have formally said, okay, on certain conditions we'll recognize Israel, and it hasn't gone anywhere. Hostility has grown. The Arab community in the diaspora, Muslim students associations in this country and even more so in Europe, have exploited this enormously. And they're very good at it. And we are up against it. And when we say, you know, to be a Jew is to be on this side of the line, if you're on that side of the line, we've just told you, we're your enemy. Here's us, here's you. Even the idea that when we go around saying Israel, the Jews of the diaspora are Israel's first line of defense or second line of defense. We are one. We are with Israel. Whatever Israel does is okay by us. We've just put a big kick me sign on our backs. We have a Palestinian who doesn't mind blowing up a pizza place full of toddlers in order to teach Israel a lesson. They aren't fighting. They're not shooting the Palestinians. They're uninvolved. They're toddlers. They're blowing up a bus in Haifa with Jewish and Arab commuters on their way to work. They're not involved. It's not their fault, but that's a form of warfare they have adopted. If they're going to blow up a bus in Haifa or a pizza parlor full of toddlers, why wouldn't they blow up a JCC in the Bronx? We are one. So we should certainly, those who believe in what they believe in should be brave and stand up. We should be teaching students what is true and false in the Middle East so they can defend themselves when they hear stuff they never heard before. We should be teaching them it's possible to love someone without liking them. You all have uncles that you can't stand, but you love them because they're your family. You can love Israel without liking everything it does. Here's what Israel actually does. Here's what you're going to hear when you go to college. And one last thought. When I was in college 40 years ago, there was a labor government in Jerusalem. The left was very active on campus, attacking Israel all the time. The Jewish Agency, the World Zionist Organization, with the encouragement of the Israeli government, was funding left-wing Jewish students to answer the left in its own language. And we were effective because we won over listeners. Now, Jewish students are discouraged from answering as the left. If you don't support the Israeli government, Israeli policies, we're not going to support you. And so the answers that the left gets aren't effective. They don't speak to the mindset of the left. But I'm going on forever, so I'll stop.
Thank you. I'm just going to suggest that we hold applause till the close of the program. Or boos, for sure. Okay, I wanted to ask, I have a lot of questions, but I'll have to choose. I wanted to ask you about the question of optimism. I think that you each diagnose the problem differently. We all kind of agree there's a real problem with the American Jewish conversation about Israel, and you each diagnose it differently, whether it's about not having sufficient courage to speak up, or the perils of not being inclusive, putting people outside the community. But I want to ask, given each of those diagnoses, do you see reason to be optimistic? And if so, why? And if not, then tell us that too. And just to be clear, I'm not talking about optimism about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but optimism about the state of our Jewish community around this conversation. And maybe, Melissa, I'll start with you again, just because you seem to indicate that you have a lot of optimism in your opening remarks.
Okay, I've started each time, so I don't know if I want to, should I just defer to, I'm happy to jump in, but, okay, all right. So I was also thinking about how each of us characterize the problem. And actually, much of what you described, Jonathan, in terms of students who are pro-Israel advocates on campuses who are trying to defend Israel and support for Israel, feeling marginalized and silenced, really resonated with me. And I think that is becoming pervasive. And actually, this isn't yet in response to your question, but is related. The way that I would characterize the problem is that is happening, and also students on the left are also being silenced. And so what you get is a sort of effect of some students are shouting into megaphones, and some other students are shouting into megaphones a little bit louder so they can be heard, and then everybody else is sticking their fingers in their ears and walking away. And so the big problem is really disengagement and retreat from the conversation. In terms of reasons for optimism, the primary reasons I actually referenced in the opening, which are that I think that there's now widespread recognition among communal leaders that there's a problem, to the point that federations come to us and say, we have emergency funds for addressing this conversation. Please do something about it. We can't keep up with demand among Hillels and synagogues and boards of rabbis and JCRCs who are saying, help, we're in crisis. So just the fact that 10 years ago we were speaking a foreign language and now everybody seems to recognize there's an issue is reason for hope. And we also have strategies that work. We don't have a big enough bench to meet the demand that's out there yet in terms of people with expertise to address it. But the fact that we can get 40 people in a room who are scared to be there to have a meaningful, productive, focused, direct conversation about their differences after surfacing where they really disagree and learn something from each other gives me a lot of reason for hope. And you said that this was about the American Jewish conversation, not Israel, but actually I want to say something about Israel that goes to something JJ said. JJ quoted Stephen Cohen saying that that one of the big divisions between the left and the right, if we're going to label people in that way, is over whether people believe peace is possible. And that actually, I really, in my experience, is no longer true. I do a lot of exercises in rooms of Jewish leaders and young Jews on campus where we have a prompt. Do you believe, we have a series of prompts. And we've done this with thousands of people now. And we ask them to line up in accordance with the degree to which they agree or disagree with statements like, I believe that there will be a resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in my lifetime. And now, and this is heartbreaking, but almost every room that we're in, there's 3 people who agree with that statement and 35 people who disagree. Whether people are on the right or the left, most people no longer believe that there is going to be a resolution to the conflict in their lifetime. Where people, I think that the bigger marker is more about who people believe bear responsibility for the total deterioration and unraveling of hope in relation to Israel's future in the near and immediate term.
Okay.
So I'm much more optimistic about the American Jewish conversation, if you didn't gather
Interesting.
that.
I actually have the opposite point of view, but first I want to say something about red lines. By way of just sort of introduction, personally, about almost exactly 20 years ago, I wrote a column back 2 jobs ago, without going into the whole story, respectfully advocating endogamy. And the world came down on my head, and I was really bashed around and praised unduly by other sectors, and it became a whole big thing. And as a result of that, I wound up being invited to address intermarriage outreach groups, nonstop for the next 2 years, which was an interesting result. And I learned a lot from that. And what I learned, other than meeting a lot of very interesting people and having a deeper understanding of the issue, was that everybody, no matter where they were on the religious spectrum, whether they were intermarried or not, all believed that there needed to be some lines drawn about what was who was a Jew and who wasn't a Jew, and what was a Jewish community and what wasn't. Everybody thought that there should be some lines. They just disagreed on where the lines would be drawn. So when I hear this discussion about red lines and people saying, you're just being destructive, don't draw lines, you're dividing us, you're weakening us, you're showing fear, my gut reaction to that is to say, everybody believes. We all know that there always are going to be some lines that we're not going to cross over. Yours may be different than mine, his may be different than mine, but we all believe, we all know that there is a line between what is within the community and what isn't. And we know if we have no lines at all, then we are no community. Now, as to optimism and pessimism, as far as Israel, I'm very optimistic. I mean, I tend, as a journalist, always to be pessimistic in the short term and optimistic in the long term. And as far as Israel's concerned, as dismal as the situation can be seen, I take a long view I try to take a long view, and I see what's happened in the last 60 years is, it's like we have lived in an age of miracles. And I have tremendous faith, really, b'emunah shalema, perfect faith that Israel will survive, it will grow, it will be strong. Maybe eventually there will be peace in the sense of, as Jabotinsky wrote in the Iron Wall essay, 80 years ago, that eventually the other side will be willing to make peace when they understand that Israel cannot be destroyed. JJ and I disagree on whether they've reached that point, but I believe eventually that will happen. Maybe not in my lifetime, probably not in my lifetime, but I believe Israel will survive. When it comes to American Jewry, here at home, I'm not quite so optimistic. Why? Well, because I read the Pew survey, like the rest of you, and I see lots of negative trends, and all the things that we were talking about 20 years ago when the first big survey came out in 1990, and all the Federation execs had heart attacks because they realized that no one might be around to pay their salaries in another generation, and so there was a spurt of activity. The reaction to the Pew survey, and I speak as someone who was part of a group along with Jack Wertheimer of this institution, Steve Cohen referenced here, Steve Bam, the AJ committee, trying to work up a Jewish response to get some alarmism going about Pew and what it means. And while, we produced a paper which hopefully will get a little publicity, I'm very discouraged about the unwillingness of the community, because I believe these problems about being willing to stand up for Israel and caring about Israel and understanding that if you are agnostic, if you're neutral about whether Israel should be destroyed or whether Israel should be boycotted, that's okay. I think it's related to these broader trends that were related in Pew, and I don't see this community rising up trying to do something about it. So in that sense, I'm kind of pessimistic, but as far as Israel, I believe it'll be okay.
I want to quote, go ahead.
Scattering of applause.
The late Israeli Prime Minister Levi Eshkol, a statement that's attributed to him. I'm optimistic in the sense that I'm hopeful that things will turn out well. I'm pessimistic in the sense that I fear my optimism is ill-founded. I spent a lot of years after the 1990 National Jewish Population Survey, the 52% intermarriage, writing and speaking, arguing based on sources inside the sociological and demographical community that the number was wrong, that it was significantly less than 50%, and that 52% gets everybody's attention because it's more than half. Avi Becker, who was the Secretary General of the World Jewish Congress for a while, once testified before a Knesset committee that 52% of American Jews are assimilating every year. What? Disappearing? We'd be at zero by this point. The organization that ran the survey acknowledged 12 years later that indeed the number had been wrong. In the meanwhile, it's 55 or 60%. So who was right and who was wrong? I guess now my family's yelling at me. You spent 12 years fighting about this thing, and now it turns out you were wrong anyway. What's interesting is that apparently among over 65s, the percentage of children of intermarriage, adult children of intermarriage, who say, I am Jewish, who identify themselves as Jewish, was about 20 or 25%. It's about 30% for the baby boomers, a little less than 40% for Generation X, the people now in their 30s and 40s. And among the millennials, the people who were born around the turn of the century, or a little before it, came of age. The current generation on campus and in their 20s, 60% identify themselves as Jewish, adult children of intermarriage. Now, follow this. If there are 2 Jews, let's say there's 4 Jews, and they all marry each other, and they each couple has 2 children. The result is 4 Jewish children. Let's say there are 4 Jews, 2 of them marry each other, and the other 2 marry Gentiles. You now have 3 couples. If half of the children of the Gentiles identify themselves as Jewish, we've broken even. So if 60% of the adult children of now, when you ask the intermarried families, the intermarried adults, the parents, are you raising your children in the Jewish religion? Something like 28% say yes. Another 20% say in both. 20% say as Christians. But the children who grow up and make their own decisions and say, I am Jewish, is 60%. And going up. There is enormous cause for what kind of Jewish will that be? God only knows. I'm sure that if you had asked a priest in the temple in 200 before the Common Era what they would make of a community that davens and keeps kosher and lives in Cleveland, what kind of Jew is that? Something is changing in our community, in our religion, in our Jewish society. I don't know what it will be, but apparently it's going to be something if the adult children of intermarriage continue to choose to identify themselves as Jewish. So part of the question is, who's going to replace Jon Stewart? I'm worried. There are so many Jewish symbols in our society to make you proud and want to be Jewish. And the other question is, what will the Jewish community look like in America in 10 or 15 or 20 years? Will it be something that people, given a choice, will want to identify with? The president of Princeton found out a couple of years ago that he was Jewish. His mother had married a Gentile, never told the kids they were Jewish, didn't want it was just after World War II, when apparently a great many people married non-Jews and raised their children without any knowledge of their background, so they wouldn't walk around with, as a friend of mine who found out she was Jewish as an adult, is a death sentence. Being Jewish, you learned in 1944, is a death sentence. So you marry somebody who's not Jewish, you bury the whole thing, and your children grow up as Gentiles. And then they find out, Christopher Hitchens found out in his 30s that he was Jewish. Tom Stoppard, the playwright, found out in his 40s that he was Jewish. George Allen found out from the forward that he was Jewish, that their mothers were Jewish. And it is deeply, Wesley Clark, the general, found out in college. A first cousin came and said, you know, we're first cousins. Your name was originally Cohen. And it changes their lives because being Jewish means something positive in today's world. If America looks at the Jewish community and says they're in favor of dropping bombs, they're in favor of war, they're in favor of this narrow, isolationist, whatever, if we become a political party that is repulsive to the demographic that we represent, I fear that the next generation of half-Jews, if you will choose the other way.
Thank you. So I want to take about 10 minutes or so for questions from you all, and I invite you to go to the microphone if you have a question. I have one more burning question, which you can decide whether or not you want to address it at some point. I don't want to take more time for myself, but at least I'll ask it. I'm so curious to know what you all think is or is not the impact on Israel of our conversation here. You know, we heard a range from you all, from Israel can take care of itself, irrespective of our conversation here, to the future of Israel depends on our machloket l'shem shamayim here in America. So I'm curious about that. You can decide whether or not to address it at some point. But in the meantime, we'll invite questions from you. So let me just ask you to speak loudly when you ask your question. And when you ask your question, please do keep it brief and to the point. And feel free to specify if your question is for a particular panelist. We'll start over here.
Hi, my name's Ira. I'm a graduate of Liss College at JTS. And I'm curious, it's become fairly common knowledge that Eric Fingerhut dropped out of the J Street conference and speaking to a lot of Jewish students, primarily because of threats from Sheldon Adelson.
Sheldon Adelson.
Or a number of, so whoever it is, donors on the right, I think is fair to say. And I don't know of any examples, for instance, of that happening, you know, left-wing donors, for instance, pressuring folks to drop out of the APAC conference or an equivalent. And so to me, it seems like one of the major fault lines is that one side of the aisle within the Jewish community when it comes to Israel has far more power, or perhaps money to throw around than the other side, if you want to break it down to two sides. And so I'm curious, particularly for JJ and Melissa, how much of this do you think is that we're not dialoguing respectfully or appropriately, and how much of it comes down to there being a significant differential in power between, again, these, to be simplistic, these two sides of the aisle within the Jewish community?
Before that, you wanted to hear from them, but I'll just say one thing. You think liberal Jews have no power in this country? Are you kidding me? You think liberal Jews have no power in Jewish communities? You were just talking about how a New Israel Fund donor is the head of the federation here. You think liberal Jews have no power? Really? Just leave it at that. Well, I guess what I'm trying to say is liberal Jews have a lot of power in this country. Look at, not all the Sheldon Adelson isn't the only one who gives to politicians. The Democrats get a lot of money too.
Conservative Jews with a small c. Sorry, Arnie. The small c Jews, conservatives, right-wing Jews, hawks, tend to give money on the basis of Israel. Liberal Jews, even when they think of themselves as donating out of a sense of liberalism, out of a sense of Jewish identity and Jewish values, tend to give on the basis of domestic social values. So a liberal Jew will withhold their donation because of abortion. They're not going to vote yes. They're not going to punish that's what J Street wants to do. It wants to emulate the donors on the right and use money to encourage politicians to vote their way. Part of the problem is that it's the hawks who will change their vote because Israel is the thing that matters the most. Democrats are not going to vote for a Republican because the Democrat is the wrong way in Israel. They're going to switch their vote based on the issues they care most about. One more thought. If you live basically in fear, if your primary issue is the threats to the Jewish community from the hostile, anti-Semitic, Gentile, from the Goyim, you have many fewer ways to spend your Saturday night. Because there's a whole lot of places that a liberal Jew will go, causes the liberal Jew will participate in, that a hawk, a conservative, and what we call right wing, will not. They're going to be more, so they are overrepresented at Jewish events. Jewish leaders like Elisa Doctoroff, like Seymour Reich, like all of these people Abe Foxman, they show up at meetings and they're always surprised to find, they read the polls that show that 70% of the Jews are Democrats, and they show up at meetings and the people who raise their hands always seem to be right wing, because that's who shows up. The liberals have a problem, which is that, the other statistic is synagogue attendance is also a predictor of voting. The more often you go to synagogue, the more likely you are to vote Republican and to support Israel's current policies and, in the end, to support settlements, to believe not that they aren't a problem, but that they are the solution. So I guess I've answered the question. I want to come up with a declarative statement to end it, but I haven't got one.
So I think that there are differentials in power, and there are asymmetries in terms of the extent to which people care primarily about Israel, or they prioritize other issues, as JJ was saying. And I want to say that I have worked with many institutions in which the left was actually putting donor pressure on the leaders every bit as much as the right. I think there's a widespread perception that this doesn't happen from the left, and in my experience, it happens more from the right, but not only. And that often part of what happens is that when there's an institution that feels more progressive, that a lot of times people who identify as more progressive feel like this is, You know, this is one of our only islands in the Jewish world. They're kind of reacting against this sense that a lot of other institutions have marginalized them, and so they want to cling to that, and they want to, they too want their institution to not only be inclusive and to stand for something. This actually gives me a chance to respond to something else that I wanted to earlier and what Jonathan said. Jonathan talked about not only standing for inclusivity as a virtue, and I talked earlier about that putting limits on inclusivity actually undermines often what we stand for when we stand for Israel. There's also something else I want to draw out here. I think that saying that inclusivity is our only virtue is actually setting up a straw man. I don't know if you were implying that that's what I was arguing, but I want to say very clearly it's not. That one of the things that happens on a practical level in institutions is that often inclusivity comes into play because an institution simply doesn't agree what people stand for. And you get leaders who are out, they are further to the right or to the left than some of their constituents and some of their stakeholders, and then they have to make an institutional decision. How are we both going to stand for things and be inclusive? How are we going to deliberate about the things that we disagree? How are we going to allow our leaders to have their conscience and their authentic voices and still create channels of expression and recognition for people who disagree with us? So often what happens is there's simply tensions between what we stand for and disagreements over what we stand for in institutions, and this happens from both the right and the left. Donors and just grassroots constituents.
Let's take a question from this side.
Yeah, my name is Gil Kulik, and my voice is not generally like this, but I couldn't resist the urge to speak, even though my voice may be a little bit annoying. This question is directed to Jonathan Tobin, although in perfect honesty, there may not be a question mark at the end. I disagreed with many of the things you said, but one statement which jumped out at me, particularly egregious, was your dismissal of the settlements issue as passé, that it is no longer relevant, that it's moot, that we need to move on. We need to move on to worry about Israel's security, as though this issue has nothing to do with Israel's security. I mean, in my view, it has everything to do with Israel's security, because so long as this issue is not resolved, it will continue to be not only an irritant, but a casus belli in many people's minds. And I'm wondering, I guess there is a question mark here, how you can dismiss an issue which is really goes to the heart of the nature of Israel as a democracy and as a liberal society, and whether you honestly believe that we can talk about Israel's security while ignoring this issue.
Well, we've been very careful about trying to characterize each other's arguments accurately up here. I think you're mischaracterizing what I said. I didn't say discussions about settlements are passé. I said discussions about the peace process and whether it was imminent or not are really passé, because what has happened, the reason why the overwhelming majority of Israelis, whether they're left-wingers or right-wingers, don't think that the peace process has any chance, in the foreseeable future, is that Israel has already withdrawn from settlements, and they instead of trading land for peace, they traded land for terror. And as much as I believe the overwhelming majority of Israelis would be more than willing to give up most of the West Bank, except the settlement blocks in Jerusalem, but they don't want to replicate the experiment in Gaza and the West Bank. That strikes them as insanity. And who can blame them? Well, maybe you can, but I don't. So I don't feel I don't feel that's not the point. My point is that dancing around the same arguments for the last 20 years doesn't go to the question of why the peace process failed. I believe that why the peace process failed is because the Palestinians rejected peace in 2000, 2001, 2008, and for all intents and purposes have rejected it again last year. Now, JJ has a slightly different point of view about it, but that's why I said what I said. That's why the election results in Israel have gone the way they've gone the last few years. So you can argue with that. You can wish that wasn't so. Maybe in one sense or another, we all wish it wasn't so. But that's the fact. I'll take just one more thing to our questions about, who gets shut up. And one anecdote, which goes to something that Melissa said. See, and I was ready to be shut up. That's how conditioned we are. During the 10 years that I was editor of the Jewish Exponent, which is for those of you who don't know, is the community, the sole and dominant community newspaper of Jewish Philadelphia, which has a market dominance that no Jewish newspaper has here in New York. And as part of my job, I went and spoke at virtually all the synagogues over the course of 10 years, every Orthodox, every conservative one. There were a handful of synagogues that refused to invite me. Handful. And I can name each one of them. I won't now. It doesn't mean anything to you and means even less to me now. But the reason why I was not invited there was because of my politics, because I was too right-wing for them. Now, personally, it didn't bother me because there were always more than enough places for me to go on Sunday mornings and be served stale bagels in return for free entertainment for the people who had dropped off their kids at Hebrew school. But there were lots of people who wanted to shut me up, who wanted my views not to be heard at their Reform or Reconstructionist synagogue because I was too right-wing. So go figure.
So we have just about 2 minutes left, so I'm going to take one last question. I'm going to ask you, if at all possible, keep from this side, to keep it to like 30 seconds, and maybe you guys can shoot for 30 seconds too, and we'll tie it up in a bow.
What about the side?
Less than 30 seconds.
How about the side?
It was eeny, meeny, miny, moe.
How do you explain that Jewish Voices for Peace is the fastest growing Jewish organization today?
Well, I don't know that it is. I know it's making gains on J Street, and I think the reason why has to do with a lot of factors. You know, I don't believe it's because the Israelis are behaving in a beastly manner. I believe that Israeli efforts to make peace, you know, sometimes have the inverse effect on delegitimization of Israel. I think that's an unfortunate and ironic, you know, conclusion over the last 20 years. I believe that the growth of the anti-Zionist left in this country has to do with a lot of different factors, whether it's media bias against Israel, whether it's also just the diffusion of the American Jewish community that has to do with that has more to do with Pew than it does with Netanyahu.
So my understanding, and I hesitate to even say this because I don't fully know, but my understanding is that it's not entirely clear what the membership base is of JVP that's growing. There's clearly tens of thousands of people who have joined, and they don't ask, are you Jewish or are you not? So that's just something to raise a question about. We don't actually really know. But to answer your question, it's clear that there are a lot of Jews who are gravitating to JVP and finding it very appealing. So to answer your question more directly, I think that it goes to what I said earlier in terms of the pessimism. There's a sense among many that people said for years and years and years the two-state solution is dying. People on the left said the two-state solution is dying. There's a window of opportunity and it's closing and it's closing. And I think that there are people who believe that the horizon is dead and that the route for diplomacy no longer exists, and that something that was on its deathbed has gone into hospice. That is becoming an increasing viewpoint that has followers. And then increasingly there are people who similarly think the route for diplomacy is dead because we don't have a Palestinian partner and there's no, and we all know these arguments, I think. I won't restate them in my 30 seconds. And so there's been articles about this. There's simply a widening gap and polarization of people who are gravitating toward ways forward that are further to the left and further to the right than where the community was at even 2 years ago.
Well, if you look at the rapid growth of the Hasidic communities, I'm guessing maybe there's a higher birth rate among JVP. I don't know. Given what they're up to over the weekends. But I think I sort of buy what Melissa's saying, with the addition of there is a mood on campus of activism. People want to do something. And JVP gives you a feeling that you're doing something to end the Middle East conflict. There's a mood on campus of, the mood on the left in general. You identify with the underdog. And when an Israeli troop goes out to stop a Palestinian demonstration, you see soldiers with guns pointing at kids with rocks. And there's no way to make that look good. And as long as Israel remains in that position, more and more American teenagers are going to identify with the underdog. And that's why I said we need to teach our kids how to love without necessarily liking. We need to teach our kids that, you know, it may not look good to you. You may agree with one side or the other, but remember, those are your cousins. That's why birthright works, by the way. Because you go there and you realize, yeah, these are my people. I don't like some of what they're doing. It's interesting, there was a poll that came out last year, the year before, that showed the identification, affection, attachment to Israel goes down with each younger decade of age. And so does support for the Israeli government, endorsement of Israeli positions, until you get to under 35, at which point support for Israeli government positions continues down, but attachment and affection for Israel shoot up. Apparently, birthright has created a tremendous sense of identification among enough young Jews that it shows up in surveys. The young Jews, when asked questions about identification, attachment, wanting to be there and so on, they look like the 50-year-olds, the 55-year-olds. But when you ask them, do they agree with, which side do they think is right or wrong, and so on, it's the straight line down. And to some extent, I think that some of, as I said before, some of the JVP people are feeling that, even if they won't say it out loud. They want to be involved because they care about Israel. And they despair, and the mainstream community, from me to Jonathan, isn't really offering them something that feels right.
I want to thank everyone for your questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to everyone, and to thank our panelists for your very thoughtful remarks, and more than anything for really modeling what a civil disagreement looks like. As I mentioned earlier, it's now Yom HaZikaron, and we're going to have just a very brief ceremony because of that, but a round of applause for our speakers. Thank you so much.